Billionaire's son fired tech genius for being black. Now she's saving his rival's empire. Hi, my beautiful family. Thank you for sticking around with me through these times. I really appreciate your love and support. We're finally back again to give you many more beautiful stories. If you're already hooked in for today's story and ready to enjoy it, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Because tomorrow, I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now let us begin. He fired his top tech genius for being black and wearing a hoodie. Now, with his family's billion-dollar company collapsing, he must beg her to save him. But she already works for his rival. This is a story of redemption, karma, and unexpected love. The heart of Davenport Innovations wasn't on the 80th floor, behind the sprawling mahogany desk where its legendary founder, Alastair Davenport, had once changed the world. It wasn't in the sleek, glass-walled boardrooms where deals worth 9 figures were signed with the whisper of a pen. It wasn't even in the bustling open-plan offices where marketing teams spun narratives of disruption and synergy. The real heart was in the sub-basement, a place most employees had never seen. It was a climate-controlled sanctuary of humming servers, a city of blinking green and amber lights laid out in meticulously organized rows. The air was cool and smelled of ionized dust and ozone, a scent that, to Zora Vance, was more comforting than any perfume. This was her cathedral, and in the hushed, rhythmic pulse of the server farm, she was the one true god. Tonight, the god was tired. It was 3:17 a.m. Zora sat cross-legged on the anti-static floor, not in a $1,000 ergonomic chair, but on a foam pad she'd brought from home. Her laptop, a scarred and sticker-bombed machine that looked more like a relic than a high-powered workstation, was propped on an overturned server casing. A cascade of luminous green text scrolled down the screen, a language only she and a handful of people on the planet could truly comprehend. For 3 weeks, the company's flagship logistics software, Nexus, had been plagued by a ghost, a tiny, recursive error that was causing data packet loss at a rate of 0.03%. To the executives upstairs, it was an acceptable margin of error. To the clients, global shipping conglomerates, emergency services, and national power grids, it was a ticking time bomb. To Zora, it was an ugly, dissonant chord in the middle of her symphony. Her fingers, long and elegant, flew across the keyboard. They didn't just type, they danced, a fluid, intuitive choreography of motion and logic. She wore her uniform, faded black jeans, worn-out sneakers, and her favorite hoodie. The hoodie was charcoal gray, its fabric softened by 1,000 washes, the drawstrings long gone. On the back was a faded, screen-printed image of the Mandelbrot set, a fractal pattern of infinite complexity. It was her armor and her comfort blanket. A soft chime from her laptop. Her eyes, a deep, intelligent brown, narrowed. There. She saw it. The error wasn't in the primary codebase, or the subroutines, or the patches applied by the senior engineering team. They had all been looking at the painting, trying to find the one misplaced brushstroke. Zora had been looking at the canvas itself. A flaw in the foundational data compression algorithm, her predecessor, had written 7 years ago. It was a masterpiece of efficiency, but it had a blind spot, a 1 in a trillion mathematical probability that the system's recent surge in traffic had finally triggered. A slow smile spread across her face. It wasn't a smile of triumph, but of quiet, deep satisfaction. The kind a watchmaker feels when the final gear clicks into place and the second hand begins its perfect, silent sweep. She wrote a new string of code. Not a patch, but a self-correcting script, an elegant strand of digital DNA that would not only fix the current problem, but inoculate the entire system against any future mutations of it. It was less than 40 lines. It was, she knew with a certainty that was as much a part of her as her own heartbeat, perfect. You got it, Z? She turned. Ben, a senior network engineer with tired eyes and a perpetually worried expression, stood in the doorway, holding 2 cups of what smelled like burnt coffee. He looked at the serene flow of data on her screen, and his shoulders slumped in relief. It's done, she said, her voice a little rough from disuse. Push the script to staging, run the diagnostic for an hour. If it's clean, deploy it system-wide. Ben shook his head in awe, placing a cup beside her. 3 weeks. We had 3 teams from 2 continents working on this. They wrote a 50-page report on why it was impossible to isolate. You did it in what? 6 hours. The report was looking in the wrong place, Zora said simply, taking a sip of the coffee. It was terrible, but it was warm. They were loud. The problem was quiet. "You hear things we don't, Zora," he said, and it was the highest compliment he could give. "The whole 7th floor, the guys who actually know how this place runs? We know who keeps the lights on." "Thank you." She just nodded, her gaze already back on the screen. The praise was nice, but it was fleeting. The code, the elegant, immutable truth of it, that was real. That was what lasted. Yet, as Ben retreated, leaving her alone once more in the humming silence, a faint, familiar ache settled in her chest. It was the bittersweet pang of being the ghost in the machine. The pillar in the basement. Everyone who mattered knew. But no one with a nameplate on a desk upstairs had a clue. They saw the profits, the stability, the magic of Nexus, and attributed it to corporate strategy and market positioning. They didn't see the girl in the hoodie, sitting on the floor, holding it all together with 40 lines of code. Have you ever been the invisible engine behind something great, feeling both proud of your work and pained by the lack of recognition? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear how you navigated that feeling. Zora took another sip of coffee and pushed the feeling down. The work was what mattered. The rest was just noise. 900 feet above her, in the sterile silence of the 80th floor CO suite, Julian Davenport was also staring at a screen. Not at lines of code, but at his own reflection in the darkened floor-to-ceiling window. The sprawling, glittering metropolis of the city unfolded behind him, a kingdom he had just inherited. He adjusted the knot of his silk tie, a deep crimson that was supposed to project power. The suit was bespoke, a sharp Italian-made charcoal wool that cost more than Zora's entire wardrobe, probably including her car. Every detail of his appearance was curated, from the platinum watch on his wrist to the artfully casual sweep of his dark hair. He was the image of a modern corporate titan, a worthy successor. It was all a lie, and he knew it. The office felt alien. It was his father's space, and Alastair Davenport's presence lingered like a phantom. The faint scent of his father's favorite pipe tobacco seemed embedded in the leather of the chair. The books on the shelves were his father's, dog-eared copies of Marcus Aurelius and biographies of industrial magnates. On the massive desk, beside a state-of-the-art holographic monitor, sat a piece of unpolished obsidian, a rock Alastair had picked up on a trip to Iceland. It was a reminder, his father had said, that immense power could come from the most unassuming of sources. Julian just thought it was an ugly paperweight. His father was not dead, but he might as well have been. A massive stroke 6 weeks ago had left the great Alastair Davenport in a hospital bed, a titan silenced, his brilliant mind trapped in a body that would not obey. And so the mantle had passed. Not earned, but given. Julian, his only son, was now the CEO of a $20 billion global technology firm. And he was terrified. He cleared his throat, turning away from his reflection to practice his speech for the 5th time. His voice echoed in the oppressive quiet. Friends, colleagues, family, the Davenport family, he grimaced. Too sentimental. He started again. Team. Today marks a new chapter for Davenport Innovations. A chapter of dynamic growth, of forward-thinking synergy, of. The words felt like ash in his mouth. They were hollow, corporate platitudes he'd learned in business school. They weren't him, but then again, he wasn't sure who he was. For 32 years, he'd been Alastair's son. A name that opened every door, but earned him no respect. He saw it in the eyes of the board members, the senior VPs, the old guard who had built this company alongside his father. They saw a pale imitation, a boy in a man's suit. His insecurity curdled into a hot, bitter resentment. They thought he couldn't fill his father's shoes? Fine. He'd throw the old shoes out. He'd bring in his own. He would reshape this company in his image. Sleek. Modern. Ruthless. No more of his father's sentimental attachments to legacy, employees or quirky, nonconformist departments. It was time for a purge. A statement. Claire. He barked into the intercom on his desk. His executive assistant's voice came back instantly, crisp and efficient. Yes, Mr. Davenport? The town hall is set for 9 a.m.? Yes, sir. The entire company will be watching via live stream. The main auditorium is at capacity. Good. And after the town hall, clear my schedule. I'm going to do a walkthrough. Top to bottom. There was a fractional pause. The entire building, sir? Including the sub-level labs and the network operations center. Julian's jaw tightened. He could hear the unspoken question in her voice. Your father never went down there. He left those people alone. That was all the motivation he needed. Especially the sub-levels, he said, his voice cold. I hear it's a mess down there. No professionalism. People who don't understand that this is a multi-billion-dollar corporation, not a college dorm room. It's time our brand identity was consistent across all levels of the company, from the boardroom to the boiler room. Very good, sir. He cut the connection and looked back at the city lights. A fierce, desperate need to prove himself surged through him. He would be more than Alistair's son. He would be the man who took Davenport Innovations and made it stronger, leaner, better. He would carve his own legacy, and if that meant cutting away the parts of his father's that he deemed weak or unsightly, then so be it. He would start by making an example of someone. He didn't know who yet, but he would find them. Someone who represented the old way. Someone who didn't fit his new vision. Down in the humming heart of the company, Zora Vance compiled the final lines of her script. The fix was deployed. Across the globe, Nexus stabilized. The 0.03% error vanished, as if it had never existed. A quiet wave of relief rippled through the company's digital nervous system. She stretched, her back cracking in the silence, a feeling of deep, bone-weary contentment washing over her. She had protected the kingdom once again. She was unaware of the new king, descending from his tower, looking for a dragon to slay. The soft ding of the executive elevator, arriving in the sub-basement, echoed down the long, concrete hallway. Zora didn't even look up. It was probably just the night shift security guard. She began shutting down her laptop, ready to head home and finally get some sleep, oblivious to the footsteps that were growing louder, each one a hammer blow, coming to shatter her world. The footsteps were wrong. Zora's head lifted, her instincts, honed by years of listening to the subtle rhythms of the building, screaming that something was out of place. The night shift security guard, a kindly man named Hector, had a slow, shuffling gait, his worn-out boots scuffing the polished concrete. The cleaning crew was a cacophony of rolling carts and cheerful Spanish chatter. These footsteps were different. They were sharp, crisp, and aggressively purposeful. The sound of expensive leather on concrete, echoing with an authority that had no business being in her sanctuary at what was now approaching 4 a.m. She stood up, a coil of unease tightening in her stomach. Ben had long since departed, leaving her alone in the vast, humming server room. The glass door slid open with a soft, pneumatic hiss, and two figures stepped inside. The first was Claire, Julian's executive assistant, a woman who looked as if she were perpetually holding her breath. She wore a severe black dress, and her expression was a careful mask of neutrality, but her eyes darted around the server room. At the exposed cabling Zora was rerouting, the open server racks, the foam pad on the floor, with a kind of clinical horror. The second figure was Julian Davenport. Zora didn't know his name, but she knew the type. She'd seen him in magazines her mother sometimes left at her apartment. The sharp suit, the perfect hair, the air of entitled confidence that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. He walked in not as if he were visiting a part of his company, but as if Julian exchanged a look with Claire, a small, arrogant smirk playing on his lips. The Nexus team. I see. And does the dress code for the Nexus team involve sleeping on the floor in your pajamas? The insult was so juvenile, so flagrantly disrespectful, that Zora was momentarily stunned into silence. Pajamas? This hoodie was a part of her. It had been with her through 100 all-nighters, 100 brilliant breakthroughs. It was a symbol of her work, her dedication. It's a hoodie, she said, her voice dropping a little, gaining a hard edge. And I wasn't sleeping. I was working. Working, Julian repeated, drawing the word out as if it were a foreign concept. He took a step closer, his expensive cologne an invasive scent in her clean, sterile world. Let me tell you what I see. I see an unprofessional environment. I see a lack of discipline. I see an employee who clearly has no respect for the image of this company. This was absurd. Image? He was standing in the digital core of a multi-billion-dollar enterprise that she, more than anyone, kept alive. She had just single-handedly saved the company from a cascading failure that his new executive team couldn't even diagnose. With all due respect, sir, Zora said, forcing the honorific out. My job isn't to project an image. My job is to make sure the global logistics network that your company's entire valuation is based on doesn't collapse. And I just did that. About 30 minutes ago. There was no pride in her voice, only a statement of fact. But to Julian, it sounded like a challenge. It was the exact kind of insubordination from the old guard he had been primed to expect. But coming from this woman, this black woman in a shabby hoodie who spoke to him as if he were an inconvenience, it was infuriating. It pricked the tender balloon of his insecurity, and a dark, ugly prejudice he barely acknowledged within himself began to surface. "Is that so?" he said, his voice dangerously soft. He walked over to her laptop, which was still open on the server casing. He gestured at the screen, at the elegant lines of her script. "You wrote this?" "Yes. And you expect me to believe that you—" He gestured vaguely at her again, at her hair pulled back in a simple tie, at her unassuming presence. "Are the one responsible for fixing a problem my top-tier engineers couldn't solve." The implication was clear, hanging thick and poisonous in the air between them. "Someone like you?" The room, which had been Zora's sanctuary, suddenly felt like a cage. The low, steady hum of the servers now sounded like a mocking laugh. Every blinking light was an eye, watching her humiliation. She could feel Claire's pitying gaze, Julian's smug condescension. The blood rushed to her ears. She felt a profound, seismic shift inside her. The quiet, professional detachment she had cultivated for years was cracking. "I don't expect you to believe anything," she said, her voice trembling slightly, not with fear, but with a rage so pure and cold it was almost crystalline. "The code works. That's the only thing that matters." "No," Julian snapped, his facade of calm finally breaking. "That is not the only thing that matters. This is Davenport Innovations, not some back-alley startup. We have standards. We have a brand. We present ourselves to the world as leaders, as pioneers. And that starts with our people. It starts with discipline, with respect, with looking the part." He took another step, closing the distance between them. He was taller than her, and he used his height to loom, to intimidate. "I am the new CEO of this company," he said, his voice low and menacing. "My father may have tolerated this casual Friday approach to genius, but I do not. I am building a new culture here, a culture of excellence. And you, with your hoodie and your attitude, you are not a part of it." The words hit her like a physical blow. Your attitude. The age-old accusation lobbed at black women who dared to speak with confidence, who dared to exist without apology. It wasn't about the hoodie. It was never about the hoodie. Her heart felt like a block of ice in her chest. She had poured her soul into this company. Her brilliance was woven into its very DNA. She had sacrificed sleep, friendships, a personal life, all in service of the elegant, beautiful machine she had helped to build and protect. And this man, this child playing king in his father's castle, was erasing all of it in a single, prejudiced breath. "What are you saying?" she whispered, though she already knew the answer. Julian smiled, a tight, cruel curve of his lips. "I'm saying you're fired. Effective immediately." He turned to Claire, who flinched almost imperceptibly. "Claire, have security escort. What was your name again?" He didn't even know her name. "After everything." "Zora," she said, the name tasting like glass in her mouth. "Zora Vance." "Escort Ms. Vance from the premises," Julian commanded, his back already turned to her as if she had ceased to exist. "She can collect her personal belongings. I want her out of the building in 10 minutes. Security." He was calling security. On her. In her server room. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot flush that spread from her neck to her face. She stood frozen, the hum of the servers a deafening roar. She watched him walk toward the door. This man who had, in the space of 5 minutes, destroyed her entire world with the casual cruelty of a boy stepping on an ant. 2 security guards, their faces impassive, appeared at the door. One of them held a cardboard box, the universal symbol of corporate execution. "Ma'am," one of them said, his voice gentle but firm. "We need you to come with us." Numbly, Zora walked to her station. Her hands were shaking so badly, she could barely unplug her laptop. She placed it in the box. Then, she picked up the foam pad from the floor. And finally, with a hand that felt disconnected from her body, she took off the grey hoodie. She folded it carefully, reverently, and placed it on top of the laptop. The Mandelbrot set faced up, a silent, complex witness to the injustice. She didn't look at Julian as they led her out. She couldn't. She fixed her gaze on the polished concrete floor, walking past the rows of servers, her children, her creations. The glass door hissed shut behind her, sealing her off from her life's work. They walked in silence down the long, empty corridor, then into the service elevator. The ride up was suffocating. When the doors opened into the grand, opulent lobby, the contrast was jarring. It was all marble and light and soaring ceilings, a monument to a success she was no longer a part of. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long, dramatic shadows across the floor. As the guards escorted her toward the main revolving doors, a man was just entering. He was older, with kind, discerning eyes and a quiet elegance that was the antithesis of Julian's brash style. He held the door for a colleague, his movements unhurried and graceful. Zora vaguely recognized him from industry news. Arthur Sterling, CEO of Sterling Dynamics, her father's biggest and most respected rival. She was so lost in her own vortex of pain and shock that she didn't see him. She bent to retrieve it, her entire body trembling with the effort of holding back a sob. As her fingers closed around the soft, worn fabric, a hand entered her field of vision. It was Arthur Sterling's. He knelt down, his expensive suit creasing without a moment's thought, and helped her steady the box. He looked from the box to her face, and his kind eyes registered everything in an instant. The shock, the hurt, the glassy sheen of unshed tears. He saw the security guards standing a respectful but firm distance away. He knew this scene. He'd seen it play out before, though rarely with someone who looked so utterly devastated. "Are you all right, young lady?" he asked, his voice gentle, devoid of pity, full of genuine concern. Zora couldn't speak. She could only clutch her hoodie to her chest like a shield. She shook her head, a single, hot tear finally escaping, tracing a path down her cheek. Arthur Sterling's gaze sharpened. It shifted from her face to the hoodie she was clutching. His eyes, trained by a lifetime of seeing what others missed, noticed the faded fractal on the back. He looked back at her face, at the brilliant, wounded intelligence in her eyes. And in that moment, in the cold, marble lobby of his rival's company, a seed of an idea, an intuition, a recognition, began to take root. He didn't know who she was, but he knew, with the certainty of a man who had built his own empire on recognizing true value, that the person standing before him was someone extraordinary. And the company she was leaving had just made a catastrophic mistake. He pulled a simple, elegant business card from his jacket pocket. "My name is Arthur Sterling," he said softly, pressing it into her free hand. "When you're ready to talk, I'm ready to listen." Zora stared at the card, the name embossed in simple, confident letters. She looked up at his face, at the sincere compassion there, a life raft in her ocean of despair. She gave a small, jerky nod, unable to form words. Then, turning her back on the gleaming tower that had been her home, she walked out into the cool morning air, clutching a cardboard box, a folded hoodie, and the business card of the one man who might be able to help her build a new world from the ashes of the old. The silence was the worst part. For the first 48 hours, Zora's apartment became a hermetically sealed chamber of quiet. The sleek, minimalist space, usually a backdrop for the hum of her custom-built desktop and the soft clicking of her keyboard, was now utterly still. She had unpacked the cardboard box, placing her scarred laptop on the kitchen counter like a decommissioned weapon. The hoodie, however, remained folded, sitting on her coffee table, an altar to her own desecration. She couldn't bring herself to put it on. It felt like wearing a ghost. She didn't code. The very thought of opening a terminal, of seeing that familiar black screen with its blinking cursor, sent a wave of nausea through her. Her gift, the one thing that had defined her, felt tainted, inextricably linked to the humiliation she had endured. It was like a world-class singer suddenly finding their voice stolen, replaced by a painful, rasping silence. Her fingers, usually so alive with purpose, felt like foreign objects at the ends of her hands. She moved through her apartment like a wraith. She'd stand in front of the window for an hour, watching the city breathe below, feeling completely disconnected from it. She'd open the fridge, stare at its contents, and close it again, her appetite gone. Sleep was a mercy that refused to come. When she did drift off, her dreams were a chaotic loop of blinking server lights morphing into Julian Davenport's sneering face, his voice echoing, "Your attitude. You are not a part of it." Her phone buzzed incessantly. First, it was Ben. Then other members of the Nexus team. Worried texts, then frantic calls. "Z, where are you? Heard what happened. It's BS. The system's throwing up new error flags. The script held, but something else is popping up. We can't figure it out." She ignored them all. Reading them felt like picking at a wound. Each message was a reminder of the world she'd been violently ejected from. The problems they were facing were her problems, the puzzles she was meant to solve. But she couldn't. It wasn't her place anymore. The sense of responsibility warred with a deep, primal feeling of rejection. They were his problems now. Let the man in the $1,000 suit figure it out. On the third day, a call came from an unfamiliar number. She let it go to voicemail. A moment later, a text appeared. Ms. Vance, this is Arthur Sterling. I hope you're doing okay. I meant what I said. I would be honored to speak with you whenever you feel up to it. I believe we might have much to discuss. No pressure, no agenda. Just a conversation. She stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the delete button. A part of her, the wounded, angry part, wanted to throw the phone against the wall. She didn't want charity. She didn't want pity. She didn't want to be someone's strategic acquisition, a weapon to be aimed back at Davenport Innovations. She wanted to be left alone to grieve the death of her professional life. But another part of her, a smaller, more resilient voice, was intrigued. He hadn't mentioned a job. He hadn't been aggressive or opportunistic. Just a conversation. She remembered the look in his eyes in the lobby. It wasn't the look of a corporate predator. It was the look of a man who saw her. She resisted. She put the phone down and tried to watch a movie, but the plot was a meaningless jumble of images. She tried to read a book, but the words wouldn't cohere. The silence in her apartment was no longer just quiet. It was loud, accusatory. It was the sound of her own inertia. Finally, late in the afternoon, she picked up her phone and texted back a single, terse sentence. I can talk. His reply was almost instantaneous. Wonderful. How about coffee? My treat. There's a quiet place near you, the daily grind. An hour. She stared at her reflection in the dark screen of her phone. Her eyes were hollow. She was still wearing the same t-shirt she'd had on for 2 days. The thought of facing another human being was exhausting. But the thought of another 24 hours alone in this silence was unbearable. Okay, she typed. It was the most she could manage. She pushed herself off the couch, her joints aching from inactivity. She would go. She would listen. But she wouldn't trust. She wouldn't hope. She would just go. Meanwhile, 900 feet up, Julian Davenport was living in his own kind of hell, though his was far from silent. It was a cacophony of ringing phones, panicked emails, and the increasingly strained faces of his senior executives. The initial firing of Zora Vance had given him a heady, intoxicating rush of power. He had made his statement. He had drawn his line in the sand. He felt, for the first time, like a true CEO. For a day, he basked in it, conducting meetings with a newfound, albeit counterfeit confidence. Then the whispers started. There are some anomalies in the Nexus data stream, sir. The Asia-Pacific servers are reporting latency issues we've never seen before. The diagnostic teams are running into dead ends. The architecture is unconventional. Julian, in his profound ignorance of the company's technical realities, dismissed it all. Unconventional? Make it conventional, he'd ordered. Hire the best consultants. Spare no expense. This is Davenport Innovations. We don't have anomalies. He resisted the truth with every fiber of his being. The idea that the woman he had so contemptuously dismissed could be the linchpin of his entire operation was not just unpalatable. It was impossible. It would mean his first major decision as CEO was not just wrong, but catastrophically, apocalyptically wrong. It would mean he was a fool. And Julian Davenport would not be a fool. He threw money at the problem. He brought in a high-priced consulting firm from Silicon Valley, a team of slick-haired men in matching blazers who spoke in impenetrable jargon and charged $5,000 an hour. They swarmed the offices, produced 100-page PowerPoint decks filled with complex charts, and achieved absolutely nothing. They were mechanics trying to fix a watch designed by a master horologist, and all they were doing was stripping the gears. The problems worsened. A major shipping client in Rotterdam reported that 1,000 containers of perishable goods were misrouted, costing them millions. A network of emergency response drones in California went offline for a critical 12 minutes. The stock price, which had initially seen a small bump from the news of his corporate restructuring, began to tremble, then dip. The board members, the old guard who had served his father, started circling. Their polite inquiries became pointed questions. Their respectful deference to him as Alistair's son began to evaporate, replaced by a cold, appraising scrutiny. Julian, a board member named Thomas Evergreen, his father's oldest friend, said during a tense video call. These issues all seem to have started this week. Has there been any significant personnel change in the core Nexus team? Julian felt a hot prickle of sweat on his neck. We are streamlining, he said, his voice tight. Modernizing our workforce. We parted ways with a junior-level coder. It's unrelated. Thomas's eyes, magnified by his thick glasses, narrowed. A junior-level coder? My sources in engineering said you fired Zora Vance. Alastair called her his secret weapon. He said she had the most elegant mind he'd ever encountered. The name, spoken aloud in this context of failure, was like a physical blow. Julian's denial reflex kicked in, hard and fast. My father was sentimental. Julian spat, the words tasting like poison. He allowed a culture of laxity to grow in the lower levels. Ms. Vance was a symptom of that. Her attitude was unprofessional. Her departure is a net positive for our corporate culture. He could see the disbelief on Thomas's face. He was lying, and they both knew it. But admitting the truth now was out of the question. He had to double down. He had to prove that his decision was the right one, that this was just a temporary setback, a necessary pain point on the path to greater success. He ended the call abruptly and slammed his fist on the mahogany desk. The ugly obsidian paperweight his father loved so much rattled. He stared at it, hating his father's sentimental attachment to it, hating the ghost of his father's wisdom that seemed to mock him from every corner of the room. He wouldn't call her. He wouldn't crawl back. He would fix this himself. He would show them all. He would pour more money, more resources, more pressure onto his teams until the problem buckled. He was Julian Davenport, and he would not be defeated by a ghost in a hoodie. His intercom buzzed. It was Claire, her voice strained. Sir, the CTO is on line 1. He says it's urgent. It's about the London-New York financial data exchange. He's saying the latency spikes are approaching critical levels. He's using the word meltdown. Julian stared out the window at the city below, the kingdom he was supposed to be ruling. But the buildings seemed to waver, the streets blurring. The foundations were shaking. And deep down, in a cold, terrifying part of his soul he refused to acknowledge, he knew who had built those foundations. And he knew that he was the one who had just dynamited them. He resisted the urge to panic. He smoothed his tie, took a deep breath, and jabbed the button for line 1, his voice a mask of command. Tell me what you've got, he said, a king pretending not to hear the castle walls cracking all around him. He was losing control, and his resistance was only making the inevitable fall more certain and more spectacular. Of course, I will merge the crucial events of Acts 4 and 5 into a single, seamless, and emotionally charged act. This combined act will force the characters together and then shatter their perceptions with revelations from the past. Julian Davenport stood before the floor-to-ceiling window of his father's office, but he no longer saw a city of glittering opportunity. He saw a network of vulnerabilities. Every light in every building was a data point, every moving vehicle a packet of information, and in his mind's eye, they were all flickering, threatening to go dark. The call with the London-New York Financial Exchange Consortium had been a bloodbath. The man on the other end, a crisp, merciless Brit named Sir Evan Drake, had not minced words. Mr. Davenport, your Nexus platform is no longer a tool. It is a liability. Billions in transactions are being compromised by latency and data degradation. You have 48 hours to achieve complete system integrity. If you fail, we will not only terminate our contract, we will make a public announcement that will eviscerate your stock price before the opening bell on Monday. Is that clear? It was crystal clear. It was a corporate execution order. He had disconnected the call, and a profound, terrifying silence had filled the room. The facade of the powerful CEO, the man in control, had crumbled to dust. He was just a boy again, out of his depth, terrified of failure. He slumped into his father's enormous leather chair, the seat of power, and felt it swallow him whole. His intercom buzzed, a shrill, panicked sound. It was Claire. Sir, your CTO and the lead consultant are here to see you. They say it's urgent, I know, Julian finished, his voice flat and dead. Send them in. The two men who entered looked like they'd just survived a plane crash. The CTO, a man named Gary, who had always carried himself with a boisterous, can-do attitude, was pale and his shoulders were slumped. The lead consultant, whose $5,000 an hour confidence had been so impressive 3 days ago, now just looked expensive and useless. We've failed, Julian, Gary said, foregoing the Mr. Davenport formality. The situation was too dire for titles. We've thrown everything at it. The core architecture is degrading. It's like the foundations are turning to sand. Every patch we apply causes 3 new leaks to spring up somewhere else. The original code it's too elegant, too complex. It's a closed loop. We can't get inside it without bringing the whole thing down. So what are you telling me? Julian asked, the question a hollow whisper. That it's over? The consultant cleared his throat, avoiding eye contact. There is one possibility. A theoretical solution. We'd need to build a parallel stabilization framework, something that could interface with Nexus's core protocols and offload the corrupted processes in real time. But the architecture required, the processing power, the algorithmic compatibility, there's only one company in the world that has it. Julian knew the name before the man even said it. A cold dread, heavier and more profound than anything he had ever felt, settled in his gut. Sterling Dynamics, Gary said, the name hanging in the air like a guillotine. Arthur Sterling's new Odyssey platform. It's the only thing on Earth that could talk to Nexus without both of them rejecting the handshake. Sterling Dynamics. His father's greatest rival. The man he'd seen in the lobby just days ago. The ultimate humiliation. To go to Arthur Sterling, hat in hand, and admit that his own company, his legacy, was collapsing. To beg for help. He thought of the look on the board's faces. He thought of Sir Evan Drake's threat. He thought of the headline, Davenport Innovations Implodes. The choice was between total annihilation and absolute humiliation. Get him on the phone, Julian said, his voice a rasp. He felt a phantom pain, the sting of his pride being surgically removed without anesthetic. Set up a meeting. Whatever it takes. The coffee at the Daily Grind was rich and dark, and the aroma alone was enough to stir something in Zora. It was the first sensory detail in 3 days that had managed to penetrate the thick fog of her grief. She sat opposite Arthur Sterling in a quiet corner booth, cradling the warm ceramic mug in her hands. She had managed to put on clean jeans and a simple black t-shirt, but she still felt exposed raw. Arthur didn't press. He didn't talk about technology or business or Davenport Innovations. He asked her about the university she went to. He asked her what books she liked to read. He spoke with a quiet, easy grace that slowly, painstakingly, began to dismantle her defenses. He wasn't interviewing her. He was simply seeing her. The man who taught me the most about business, Arthur said, stirring his own coffee, was a shoemaker. An old Italian man in my neighborhood growing up. He said, Arthur, people will pay for what looks good, but they will always come back for what is made well. Focus on the stitching, not the shine. He looked at her pointedly. You strike me as someone who has always focused on the stitching, Ms. Vance. Zora felt a lump form in her throat. My father was a mathematician, she said, the words coming out before she'd planned them. He used to say that numbers were the only perfect truth. No opinions, no prejudice. Just elegance and order. I guess I found that in code. A beautiful way to think about it, Arthur said softly. For the first time in days, Zora felt a flicker of something other than pain. It was a tiny spark of warmth. The feeling of being understood. I don't know what I'm going to do now, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Everything I was in that building. No, Arthur corrected her gently but firmly. Everything you are is right here. He leaned forward, his expression serious, his kind eyes holding hers. Zora, may I call you Zora? I didn't bring you here to poach a wounded employee from my rival. I brought you here because when I saw you in that lobby, I recognized something. It's a rare thing, a quality I've spent my life looking for. It's the look of a builder, an architect. He paused, letting the words sink in. I don't want to offer you a job. I want to offer you a kingdom. Sterling Dynamics is building its next generation platform. Odyssey. I want you to be its chief architect. I'll give you a team, a budget, and complete creative freedom. No board to answer to. No corporate mandates. Just you, and your vision of what the future should look like. Build what you were meant to build. And, he added, a small, knowing smile on his face, the dress code is whatever you want it to be. Zora stared at him, speechless. a kingdom, creative freedom. It was everything she had ever dreamed of, a validation so profound it almost didn't feel real. It was a lifeline thrown to her in the middle of the ocean, and for the first time, she felt her fingers reaching for it. Just then, Arthur's phone vibrated on the table. He glanced at the screen, and his eyebrows raised in surprise. "Well," he murmured. "Speak of the devil." He looked at Zora. "It's Julian Davenport. Do you mind if I take this?" Zora's heart stuttered. The name was a physical shock. She gave a numb, jerky nod. Arthur answered, his voice shifting into a mode of cool, professional neutrality. "Arthur Sterling." He listened for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a discreet tap, he put the call on a low-volume speaker. Julian's voice, stripped of all its previous arrogance, filled the small space around their table. It was strained, tense, desperate. "An unforeseen and critical systems failure with our Nexus platform," Julian was saying, the words clearly costing him. My team believes your Odyssey architecture is the only viable path to a stabilization protocol. We need your help, Arthur. I need to request an emergency meeting. As soon as possible." Zora sat frozen, the coffee mug cold in her hands. She could hear the frantic, panicked heartbeat behind his words. The man who had shattered her world was now begging for help from the man who was offering to rebuild it. The irony was so thick, so potent, it was almost dizzying. The world she had just managed to escape was now sucking her back into its orbit. Arthur listened patiently until Julian was finished. "I see," he said calmly. "My team is an hour from finishing their day. Be at my headquarters at 5 o'clock. We can talk then." He ended the call without waiting for a reply. He turned his full attention back to Zora, his eyes searching hers. "The world works in strange ways, doesn't it?" he said softly. "You don't have to be a part of this if you don't want to. Your role here stands regardless. But he's asking to be saved by the very technology you would be building. He just doesn't know it yet." Zora's mind was racing. Rage warred with a grim sense of vindication. The desire to run and hide fought against a powerful, rising sense of purpose. She thought of the code, her code, being mangled by incompetent consultants. She thought of her symphony being played by fools. "I'll be there," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'll be at the meeting." Julian walked into the main boardroom at Sterling Dynamics and felt his breath catch in his throat. The room was the antithesis of his father's dark, wood-paneled office. It was open, airy, with one entire wall made of glass, offering a panoramic view of the sunset, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet. It was a room that looked toward the future, not the past. Arthur Sterling stood near the window, his back to the door. He turned as Julian entered, his expression professionally placid. "Julian, thank you for coming." "Arthur," Julian managed, his throat dry. He had his entourage with him, Gary and 2 other terrified-looking VPs, a small, defeated army seeking terms of surrender. "My team and I have reviewed the preliminary data you sent over," Arthur said, gesturing to the long conference table. "The situation is as serious as you described." Julian steeled himself, ready to begin his rehearsed speech of contrition and desperation. But then, a figure sitting at the far end of the table, previously obscured by a holographic display, swiveled in her chair to face him. It was Zora. The sight of her hit him with the force of a physical impact. She wasn't the woman in the hoodie he had fired. She was dressed in the same simple, elegant style as at the coffee shop, black trousers and a dark silk blouse. She held a tablet in her hand, and her eyes, when they met his, were not filled with the hurt and shock he had last seen. They were cold, clear, and utterly in control. She looked at him not as a victim, but as a problem to be analyzed. The power dynamic in the room inverted so suddenly it gave him vertigo. He was the one under the microscope. He was the supplicant. She was the one with the power, sitting beside the man who held his entire company's fate in his hands. The humiliation was so profound, so complete, that he felt a wave of dizziness. "Ms. Vance is our new chief architect for the Odyssey platform," Arthur said, his voice smooth as silk, though Julian could detect a glint of steel beneath it. "Naturally, she will be leading the technical assessment for this potential collaboration." Zora didn't say a word. She just watched him, her silence more damning than any accusation. The meeting was the most excruciating hour of Julian's life. Zora spoke, her voice calm and precise, laying out the technical realities of the situation. She dissected the failure of his company with the detached precision of a surgeon. She and Arthur outlined the terms for any possible intervention. Sterling Dynamics would require unprecedented access to Nexus's source code. A Sterling-led team, her team, would have ultimate operational authority. The fee they quoted was astronomical. It was less a partnership and more a complete colonization. Julian had no choice but to agree to everything. He left the Sterling Dynamics building feeling hollowed out, a ghost in his own life. He returned to the 80th floor, the silence of his father's office a crushing weight. He was haunted by the image of Zora, so poised and powerful. He was haunted by the quiet, unassailable respect Arthur Sterling had shown her. What had his father said? Alastair called her his secret weapon. He needed to understand. Not just the technical problem, but the human one. What had he missed? What had his father seen that he had been so blind to? On a desperate hunch, he walked to the large, oak cabinet in the corner of the office. It was where his father kept his old personal effects, his private journals, and project logs from the early days. It was locked. But Julian knew where his father, a man of sentimental habits, kept the spare key, taped to the underside of the ugly obsidian paperweight. His hands trembled as he unlocked the cabinet. It smelled of old paper and leather. He rummaged through old files and binders until he found a series of encrypted digital logbooks labeled AD Musings. He spent an hour bypassing the simple encryption, and then he opened the first file. It was a video log. His father, 10 years younger, his face alive with an excitement Julian hadn't seen in years, stared back at him from the monitor. Log entry, 2014, Alastair began. I interviewed a young woman today for a junior programming position. Her name is Zora Vance. Her resume was impressive, but, my God, her mind. I gave her the Kobayashi Maru of coding problems, a recursive bug we'd been wrestling with for months. She solved it, on a whiteboard, in 15 minutes. It was like watching Mozart compose. She doesn't just write code. She thinks in it. She feels its shape. I hired her on the spot. Julian felt a chill crawl up his spine. He clicked to another file, dated 5 years later. Log entry, 2019. Nexus goes live today. The press is calling me a genius. They're wrong. I'm just the producer. The real genius is Zora. She's the architect. The soul of this machine, the impossible, self-correcting elegance at its core. That's all her. She built it from the ground up, based on some theoretical work her own father had done. It's more than a product, it's a legacy. Her legacy and mine intertwined. Julian's breath hitched. He frantically clicked to the last entry, recorded only 3 months ago, just before the stroke. His father looked older, tired, but his eyes burned with conviction. Log entry, 2023. I worry about Julian. He has the ambition, but he sees the shine, not the stitching. He doesn't understand that the strength of this company isn't on the balance sheet. It's in the minds of people like Zora Vance. If anything ever happens to me, she is the one who must guide its heart. She is my true successor. Not in title, perhaps, but in spirit. The company is, in its soul, hers. The video ended. The screen went dark, but the words echoed in the cavernous silence of the office, of Julian's mind. My true successor. The full, cataclysmic weight of what he had done crashed down upon him. He hadn't just fired a brilliant employee. He hadn't just made a bad business decision. He had betrayed his father. He had desecrated his legacy. He had taken a hammer to the very soul of the company out of his own blind, petty, prejudiced arrogance. He buried his face in his hands, and for the first time since he was a small boy, Julian Davenport wept. He wept for his father, for his company, but mostly, he wept for the hollow, ignorant man he saw in the mirror. Miles away, in the serene, light-filled offices of Sterling Dynamics, Zora stood by the glass wall, looking out at the same city. The initial audit of Nexus's code was underway, and seeing its decay, the clumsy, brutal patches the consultants had applied, felt like watching vandals deface a masterpiece. It hurt more than she expected. Arthur came and stood beside her, holding 2 mugs of tea. It's more than just a program to you, isn't it? He asked gently. Zora watched the river of headlights flowing on the highways below. When I was 16, she said, her voice soft, my father passed away. He was a theoretical mathematician. Brilliant, but he never got the recognition he deserved. He spent the last 10 years of his life working on a single theorem, a model for predicting and stabilizing chaotic patterns in complex systems. He thought it could be used for everything from weather patterns to stock markets. He called it the Nexus theorem. He never finished the proof. She took a breath, the memory still sharp. When I built the core logic for the Davenport platform, I used his theorem as the foundation. I finished his work. I named it Nexus for him. Her voice broke slightly. So when he fired me, he wasn't just taking away my job. He was erasing my father all over again. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. Arthur didn't say anything. He just placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. The gesture was small, but the understanding behind it was immense. The professional crisis had become profoundly personal. For Julian, it was a reckoning with his father's ghost and his own colossal failure of character. For Zora, it was a battle for her own father's legacy. They were bound together now, not just by contracts and code, but by the weight of the past. And as the city lights glittered below, a fragile, dangerous, and transformative path began to unfold before them, a path neither of them could have ever imagined. Understood. I will merge the emotional bonding of Act 6 with the devastating conflict of Act 7. This will create a powerful sequence where a newly formed, fragile trust is built up to its highest point, only to be immediately and brutally shattered, maximizing the emotional impact. The war room at Sterling Dynamics became their world. It was a sterile, glass-walled space dominated by a massive, interactive data screen that glowed with the cascading, sick-looking code of the dying Nexus system. For 3 days, it was a place of forced, frigid professionalism. Julian and his skeletal team would arrive in the morning, looking defeated and grim. Zora and her new, hand-picked team from Sterling, sharp, respectful engineers who looked at her with a mixture of awe and reverence, would be there waiting. The days were tense. Zora was clinical, her voice crisp as she gave orders and identified cascading failures. She never addressed Julian directly, routing all communication through Arthur or her project manager. Julian, for his part, was a ghost at the table. He was humbled, silent, and for the first time in his life, he was listening. He watched her work, and the revelations from his father's video logs played on a loop in his mind. He wasn't just watching a coder. He was watching an artist, a composer, a general commanding an army of logic. He saw the elegance his father had spoken of, the quiet, formidable brilliance that he had mistaken for a poor attitude. The shame was a constant, physical weight in his gut. The change happened on the 4th night. They were facing a hard deadline. A critical piece of the stabilization protocol had to be deployed before the Asian markets opened, or the ripple effect would be catastrophic. The teams were exhausted. Tempers were fraying. One of Julian's VPs, a man named Henderson, snapped at one of Zora's junior engineers, questioning her approach. "Are you sure that's the right call?" Henderson had sneered, his fatigue making him careless. "Because the last few right calls from this company have led us here." Before anyone on Zora's team could react, Julian spoke, his voice cutting through the tension like a razor. "Shut up, Henderson." The room went silent. Everyone stared at Julian. "Just shut up," Julian repeated, his voice quieter but more intense. He looked at the VP with a cold fury. "You have no idea what you're talking about. None of us do. Ms. Vance is in charge. Her team is in charge. Our job is to listen, learn, and do exactly as we're told. If you can't handle that, there's the door." Henderson paled and mumbled an apology. A stunned silence followed. Zora looked at Julian, truly looked at him for the first time since the meeting began. She saw something in his eyes that wasn't there before, not just shame, but a nascent flicker of genuine respect. It was the first crack in the wall of ice between them. Later that night, long after most of the teams had gone home to get a few hours of sleep, only Zora and Julian remained. A stubborn anomaly in the legacy code, a ghost of her own past work, was refusing to yield. The main screen glowed, a waterfall of incomprehensible data. Zora was on her feet, staring at it, her mind deep in the abstract space of the problem. "It's the memory allocation," Julian said softly from behind her. Zora turned, surprised he was still there. "What?" "The original subroutine for memory allocation," he said, pointing to a small, obscure block of code on the screen. "I was looking through through my father's old development notes. He mentioned it. He called it Zora's folly. A piece of code, so aggressively efficient it bordered on reckless. He said it was brilliant, but it would one day require a perfect partner to balance it." Zora stared at the code he was indicating. He was right. It was a trick she'd come up with in her early 20s. A shortcut that no one had ever noticed. No one but Alistair. And now his son. He told you about that? She asked, her voice quiet. He wrote about it, Julian admitted, his gaze falling to the floor. He wrote about a lot of things. He took a hesitant step closer. I watched his private video logs. The ones about you. The air in the room became thick with unspoken words. Zora's heart began to beat a little faster. This was new territory, more dangerous and volatile than any system crash. He saw what I was blind to, Julian continued, his voice thick with emotion. The arrogance, the prejudice. I had no idea what I was doing, what I was throwing away. There's no excuse for my behavior, Zora. None. But seeing you work, reading my father's words, I finally understand. I am so sorry. The apology, when it came, was not the slick, corporate non-apology she had expected. It was raw. It was broken. It was real. She could see the profound self-loathing in his eyes, the genuine agony of his regret. It disarmed her. The cold, hard shell of anger she had wrapped around her heart began to melt. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Thank you for saying that, she whispered. They stood in a shared, vulnerable silence for a long moment. Then, Zora turned back to the screen. Okay, she said, her voice regaining a bit of its professional crispness, though the edge was softer now. If we bypass the primary allocation and create a virtual buffer using the Odyssey protocols, you could create a feedback loop, Julian finished, his mind, sharpened by years of business strategy, immediately grasping the concept. It would not only stabilize the old system, but feed it clean data, strengthening it over time. Exactly, she said, a small, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time. For the next 4 hours, they worked together. It was a strange, fluid dance. Her deep, intuitive genius and his sharp, strategic mind. He couldn't code, but he could anticipate consequences, see market implications, and ask the right questions that helped her clarify her own path. They fell into an easy rhythm, fueled by coffee and a shared desperate goal. They talked, not just about code, but about their fathers, about the suffocating weight of their legacies. He spoke of the crushing pressure to live up to the legend of Alistair Davenport. She spoke of her quiet determination to honor the unfinished work of her brilliant, unheralded father. In the quiet, sterile war room, in the dead of night, they found a small, unexpected island of common ground. They were two sides of the same coin. One who had been given a legacy he didn't deserve, and one who had earned a legacy that was stolen from her. As the sun began to rise, Zora compiled the final piece of the stabilization script. She hit enter, and on the big screen, 1,000 red warning flags turned, one by one, to a steady, beautiful green. A wave of pure relief washed through the room. It was done. They had done it. We did it, Julian breathed, a laugh of pure, unadulterated joy escaping him. You did it, Zora corrected him softly, turning to face him. Your father would be proud. He looked at her, and in that moment, the last of his arrogant facade fell away, leaving only a raw, vulnerable man. He'd be proud of you, he said. The admiration in his eyes was absolute. An unspoken energy crackled between them. A fragile, tentative connection forged in the crucible of crisis and confession. It felt like hope. It felt like, just maybe, healing was possible. And then, the world shattered. Julian's phone buzzed on the console. It was a news alert from a major tech publication. The headline was a gut punch. Vengeful ex-employee holds Davenport Innovations hostage. Sources say fired coder Zora Vance is behind rivals' predatory power play. Zora stared at the screen, the words blurring. The article was a masterpiece of corporate assassination. It painted her as a bitter, vindictive hacker, deliberately sabotaging her former employer to exact revenge. It cited anonymous sources within Davenport, who claimed she had left backdoors in the code. It framed Arthur Sterling as a vulture, using her as a pawn to orchestrate a hostile takeover. And it painted Julian as a well-meaning but naive new CEO, a victim of a sophisticated corporate conspiracy. What is this? Zora whispered, the blood draining from her face. The fragile bond that had just formed between them evaporated, replaced by a cold, sickening dread. Julian read the article, his face turning ashen. No, this isn't true. It's It must be a leak from someone on the board. He immediately thought of Henderson, the VP he'd shut down, or others who felt threatened by the new partnership. A leak. Zora's voice was sharp with disbelief, and a rising tide of old hurts. Or a press release, Julian? A way to spin the narrative? A way to save your own skin, and make me the villain? No, I would never, he started, but his voice faltered. The accusation hung in the air, plausible because of who he had been just a few days ago. The old Julian, the one who cared only for image and power, would have done this. His phone rang. It was Claire, his assistant, her voice frantic. Julian, the board is in an uproar. The press is calling. Everyone's seen the article. Our PR department is advising an immediate response. They've drafted a statement for you. Send it to me, he said, his mind reeling. A moment later, the draft appeared on his tablet. He read it, and his heart sank. It was a carefully worded piece of corporate maneuvering. It expressed full confidence in the partnership with Sterling, but it also contained a devastatingly ambiguous line. We are still investigating the full scope and origin of these unprecedented system failures. It wasn't an outright accusation against Zora, but it wasn't a defense either. It was a hedge. It was a cowardly, calculated move to leave room for doubt, to protect himself and the company by not fully exonerating her. It left the door open for her to be the scapegoat if things went south. This is what you're going to release? Zora asked, her voice dangerously quiet. She had read the statement over his shoulder. The look on her face was one of utter devastation. The flicker of trust, of connection, of hope she had allowed herself to feel was gone, extinguished as if it had never been. She had been a fool to believe he had changed. Zora, listen, Julian pleaded, his mind in a panic, caught between the board's pressure and the look of betrayal on her face. This is just a draft. It's corporate nonsense. I can change it. We can write something else. Can you? She shot back, her voice breaking with the force of her pain. Or is this who you really are, Julian? When the pressure is on, when your reputation is on the line, you hedge your bets. You leave me out to dry. You did it once in a server room when you fired me for a hoodie, and you're doing it again, right now, with a press release. That's not fair. Isn't it? She cried, tears of rage and hurt finally welling in her eyes. I let you back in. For a moment, a stupid, naive moment, I thought. I thought you saw me. The real me. But you just see a chess piece, don't you? An asset to be managed, or a liability to be contained. She backed away from him, shaking her head, the sense of betrayal a physical sickness. I can't do this. I can't work with you. Zora, please, he begged, reaching out for her, but she flinched away from his touch as if from a hot iron. Don't, she warned, her voice trembling. Stay away from me. She turned and walked out of the war room, leaving him standing alone amidst the screens that now glowed with the green light of their shared victory. But the victory felt like ash. The fragile bond, forged in the quiet hours of the night, was not just broken, it was obliterated. He had been given a second chance, a moment of true connection, and in his moment of crisis, he had fumbled it, reverting to the coward he so desperately wanted to stop being. He stared at the ambiguous, damning press release on his screen, then at the empty doorway through which she had disappeared. He had saved his company, but he had just lost something infinitely more valuable. He had lost her. All over again. Understood. I will merge the critical decision-making of Act 8 with the final resolution of Act 9. This will create a powerful, climactic final act where the protagonist's choice directly leads to the story's redemptive and emotionally satisfying conclusion, bringing all the narrative threads together. The silence that followed Zora's departure was a living entity. It filled the war room, heavier and more oppressive than any system failure. Julian stood motionless, the glowing green screens of their triumph a cruel mockery of his personal defeat. He saw Zora's face in his mind, the flicker of hope he had put there, and the profound, soul-deep wound that had replaced it. Is this who you really are, Julian? Her question echoed in the cavernous quiet of his conscience. He picked up his tablet and stared at the drafted press release. It was the safe choice, the corporate choice. It was a shield, designed by his PR team to protect him and the company from any and all fallout. It was a document born of fear and self-preservation. It was the choice of the man he used to be, the choice of a coward. His phone buzzed again. Claire. Sir, the board is demanding a decision on the statement. They want it released within the hour. Julian looked around the empty room, at the coffee cups they had shared, at the whiteboard where she had sketched out a brilliant solution while he watched in awe. He thought of his father's words. He has the ambition, but he sees the shine, not the stitching. The stitching. The integrity. The part that holds everything together. That was what this choice was about. He could release the statement, save his position, placate his board, and lose the last shred of his own self-respect. He would forever be the man who hid behind ambiguity, the man who let the person who saved him twist in the wind. Or he could make another choice. A terrifying, career-ending, legacy-destroying choice. A choice to tell the truth. He took a deep, shuddering breath. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, the wind howling around him. He had two paths. One led back down the mountain, to safety and hollowness. The other was a leap into the abyss, with no guarantee of a safe landing, but it was the only path toward becoming a man his father, and Zora, could respect. "Claire," he said, his voice quiet but resolute, stripped of all panic and indecision. "Cancel that statement. Tear it up. Sir. And schedule a press conference. For noon today. At the Davenport Tower, main auditorium. Invite everyone. The Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, the tech press, everyone. A press conference? What is the subject, sir?" Julian looked at the panoramic window, at the morning sun glinting off the buildings of the city. His city. His responsibility. "The subject," he said, his voice clear and steady, "is the truth." Zora was in her new office at Sterling Dynamics, a beautiful, light-filled space with a view that rivaled Julian's. Arthur had insisted she take it, but the view brought her no comfort. She was packing a small bag, her movements jerky and robotic. She had told Arthur she was resigning, that she couldn't work on the Nexus project, that she couldn't be near Julian. Arthur hadn't tried to stop her. He had simply listened, his kind eyes filled with a sad understanding. "The offer to build Odyssey from the ground up will always be here for you, Zora," he'd said. "Take all the time you need." But Zora felt like time was the one thing she couldn't take. The betrayal felt fresh, a wound ripped open for the second time by the same hand. She had allowed herself to be vulnerable, and the price had been this searing, unbearable pain. She had to run. She had to put as much distance as possible between herself and the source of that pain. As she was about to leave, her laptop chimed with a notification. It was a live stream alert from a major news network. The headline made her freeze. "Live, Davenport Innovations CEO Julian Davenport holds emergency press conference." Her first instinct was to slam the laptop shut. He was going to do it. He was going to read that craven statement and cement her status as the villain. A part of her, the part that craved self-preservation, screamed at her to walk away and not watch. But a deeper, more powerful part, the part that still, foolishly, held a sliver of hope for the man she'd seen in the dead of night, couldn't look away. With a trembling hand, she clicked the link. The live feed showed the main auditorium at Davenport Tower. It was packed. The room buzzed with the energy of sharks smelling blood. Then, Julian walked onto the stage. He wasn't wearing his usual power suit. He was in a simple dark sweater and trousers, his tie gone. He looked tired, vulnerable, and utterly alone. He walked to the podium, cleared his throat, and a hush fell over the room. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady, amplified by the microphones, but somehow intensely personal. "I called you here today to correct a story. A story that you're all reporting, but also a story I've been telling myself for a very long time. And it's a lie." He took a breath and looked directly into the main camera, as if he were looking right at Zora. "The story suggests that Davenport Innovations is the victim of a corporate attack by a disgruntled ex-employee. The truth is that Davenport Innovations was the victim of its own arrogance, its own ignorance, and its own prejudice. My arrogance, my ignorance, my prejudice." A ripple of shock went through the auditorium. Zora felt her own breath catch in her throat. "A little over a week ago," Julian continued, his voice unwavering, "I fired one of our company's most brilliant engineers. Her name is Zora Vance. The reason I gave was a nonsense excuse about her attitude and her unprofessional attire. The truth is, I fired her because I was an insecure, privileged fool who couldn't stand to be in the presence of a black woman who was smarter and more capable than I could ever hope to be. It was a disgusting act of prejudice, and it was mine alone." He didn't flinch. He didn't hedge. He just stated the ugly truth for the entire world to hear. Immediately after her departure, our flagship platform, Nexus, began to fail. Not because of sabotage, but because I had personally fired the architect who built it, the pillar that held the entire structure up. When our company was on the brink of a collapse that I caused, we were saved by a partnership with Sterling Dynamics. The leaked story you've all seen frames this as a predatory move. That is another lie. The truth, he said, his voice ringing with a newfound conviction, is that the team that saved Nexus, the team that worked around the clock to repair the damage I had done, was led by one person, Zora Vance. She came back. After I had publicly humiliated her and cast her out, she came back and she saved my company. She saved my legacy. She did it not for me, but for the integrity of the work itself. He paused, and his gaze seemed to soften, to become filled with a profound, painful regret. My father, Alastair Davenport, left behind video logs. In his final entry, he called Zora Vance his true successor. Not in title, but in spirit. He said the soul of this company was hers. I see now that he was right. I am not my father's successor. I am the man who almost destroyed his legacy. Zora Vance is the one who saved it. He looked away from the cameras then, down at the podium, and for a moment, Zora thought he was going to break. But when he looked up again, his eyes were clear. Therefore, effective immediately, I am tendering my resignation as CEO of Davenport Innovations. Gasps erupted from the crowd. The flash of cameras was frantic. And I am formally asking my board to offer the position, with my full and unconditional endorsement, to the only person qualified to lead this company into the future, Ms. Zora Vance. That is all. He didn't take questions. He simply turned and walked off the stage, leaving a storm of chaos in his wake. Zora sat in her office, tears streaming down her face. They weren't tears of pain or anger. They were tears of shock, of release, of a profound, earth-shattering catharsis. He had done it. He had chosen the truth. He had sacrificed everything, his job, his reputation, his pride, to restore hers. He had not just apologized. He had performed an act of public penance. The final wall around her heart didn't just crack, it disintegrated. She stood up, wiped her tears, and walked out of her office. She walked past her bewildered team, past Arthur, who watched her go with a knowing, supportive smile. She didn't say a word. She got in the elevator, her mind a quiet space of perfect clarity. Back at Davenport Tower, Julian was in his office, now stripped of its power. He was staring out the window, waiting for the board to call and formally accept his resignation. He felt strangely calm. He had lost everything, but he had gained something back that he hadn't realized was missing. Himself. The door to his office opened. He didn't turn around, assuming it was Claire with his severance papers. That was a foolish thing to do, a soft voice said. He froze. He turned around slowly. Zora was standing there. She had come back. She was wearing her old, charcoal grey hoodie. The Mandelbrot set on the back seemed to hold the quiet wisdom of the universe. They'll never accept it, Julian said, his voice rough. The board. They won't appoint you. I know, she said, taking a step into the room. I wouldn't accept it anyway. It's your company, Julian. Your legacy to reclaim. I don't deserve it, he whispered. The man who gave that press conference does, she replied, her voice gentle. The man who chose the truth over his pride. That's a man who can learn to see the stitching. An impossible hope began to dawn in Julian's chest. He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her eyes, the forgiveness that was so much more powerful than the anger he deserved. Zora, he started, but he had no words. She closed the distance between them, stopping just before him. She looked at the ugly obsidian paperweight on his desk. Your father was right about this, she said, touching its rough surface. Power from unassuming sources. She looked up at him. You have that in you too. You just had to be broken open to find it. She reached out and did something that stunned him. She gently adjusted the collar of his sweater, a gesture of simple, profound intimacy. So what happens now? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Zora smiled, a real, radiant smile that lit up her entire face. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Now, she said, we rebuild. Together. The final scene isn't in a boardroom or an office. It's months later. A new company is being launched, a joint venture between a revitalized Davenport Innovations and Sterling Dynamics Odyssey platform. The press conference is packed, but this time, Julian and Zora stand at the podium together. He's in a simple, well-tailored suit, but he wears it with a quiet confidence, not arrogance. She's in a stylish, custom-made jacket, but on its back, subtly woven into the fabric, is the pattern of the Mandelbrot set. They announced their new platform, Legacy, designed to be the most secure and ethical technology infrastructure in the world. They field questions as equals, their report easy and natural, their minds perfectly in sync. When the conference is over, they walk away from the cameras together toward a window overlooking the city. "You know," Julian says, his voice low, "my father's last piece of advice to me was to find a partner who was smarter than I was. He said it was the only way I'd ever truly succeed." "Sounds like a wise man," Zora says, her eyes twinkling. "He was," Julian agrees. He turns to her, his expression full of a love and respect that was earned in fire. "I think I finally took his advice." He reaches for her hand, and she takes it without hesitation. Their fingers intertwine, a perfect, seamless connection. Together, they look out at the city, at the future they are building, their two legacies, once so opposed, now one. It wasn't a story of a prince and a pauper, but of two master builders who had to tear everything down to find each other, and in doing so, created something stronger and more beautiful than either could have ever built alone. The kingdom was not just saved, it was reborn. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.